Thanks for coming to this virtual workshop today from the Essential Services Commission off the back of a draft decision report that we had released just last week. Thanks for taking the time. I know it's 3:30, which is always an interesting time, mid-half hour, but appreciate you coming along today. Just want to recognise as well before we start that we are all meeting on many different places across Victoria. So firstly, I do want to just acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're all meeting today. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and the Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be joining us with this virtual stakeholder workshop today. Just want to thank you again for coming. If you don't already know me, my name is Aaron Ewan. I'm the Senior Regulatory Manager of our Energy Analysis and Reform Group here at the Commission, and I oversee reforms that we make in the energy market as well as the analysis of the market as well. As I just described before, we produced a report last week that set out a series of proposals to support customers during this time, during the coronavirus pandemic. And we've had two workshops already, one focused on residential customer support and another on small business customer support. And this workshop is focused on network charge deferrals. Now, just as context, we haven't actually proposed a draft decision on this as yet. We have, though, recognised two really important things. One is a voluntary package that was provided by electricity distributors and gas distributors regarding network charge deferrals, and also a subsequent AEMC rule change that applies to all states except for Victoria. And so really we are using this stakeholder workshop and our report to just flesh out some of the thoughts from it. We've already heard from many of you prior to this, but we think it is a useful time to bring everyone together to talk through that. We're obviously open to stakeholder submissions in a very formal sense, in any case, and we're also open to individual conversations along the way, which we've had with many of you too. Just to let you know who's around the room today, we have a series of retailers and distributors mainly here at this workshop. So from retailers, we have First Energy, AGL, Alinta, Amasim Energy Australia, ERM Power, Next Business Energy, Origin Energy, Power Club, Power Shop, Red and Lumo Energy, Simply Energy, and Tango Energy. From distributors, we have AusNet Services, Gemini, and City Power, Powercore, and United Energy. For industry organisations, we have both the Australian Energy Council and Energy Networks Australia. We have our Ombudsman in Victoria, the Energy and Water Ombudsman, EWOV. We have some people from the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning in DELP from the Victorian Government. And here at the Commission, there's a few of us here today. We have Felix Carmel, who's helping lead this work and thinking. We have Steve O, our Senior Network Analyst, Kat Harris and Matt Gianpiccolo, who's supporting the other reforms that we're proposing, and Lisa and Anne from our engagement and education arm as well from the Commission. So just wanted to welcome you all again. Just a reminder here today, we're actually recording this meeting, and we intend to publish the video and the slides and a summary as well of the discussion online. So you should be able to see that on the webpage as well if you'd like to refer to it after this as well. Just encourage you to share your thoughts verbally and encourage discussion here at this time. If you have any questions, feel free to ask it via Zoom as well. So there's a chat box that you can actually ask questions to that we'll refer to. We can also use the outcomes of this as part of our considerations when thinking of stakeholders' feedback in lieu of the formal submission, but obviously we appreciate your formal submissions in this time. So that's all I was going to say for housekeeping things and introductions. I'll pass it on to Felix shortly, just about basically the two questions that we posed in the paper that we had published last week. Again, just wanted to stress that we haven't actually made a draft decision at this time. We are reflecting on, I guess, the context that we're in regarding this. We have a few questions, but I'm very interested to hear your reflections on what's been happening to date and what could happen going forward in terms of these network charge deferrals. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Felix to go through the next few questions.
Thanks, Aaron. Hi, everyone. As mentioned before, this is the third bit of our week of workshops. Yeah, so we're looking at the network relief package that has just finished at the end of June, and what could be going forward from there. So the first slide here is really just doing a bit of a stock take of how the package has gone to date. We've talked to a lot of you during the package, mostly in, I think, April, May type aspect of it. And we heard that all retailers have signed up in full or partially to the voluntary package by the distribution businesses. Most uptake is for the small business relief aspect of it, and the 20% deferral for the small retailers as well. We've also heard that there's been a bit of a mixed view from various stakeholders, some saying that the package is good, some saying it's a little bit narrow and it's not doing enough, and others being appreciative for having the package in place. So I'll just open it up to the floor to start with, just with our first questions. How do people think the current package worked? What went well? What didn't go well? What are some things for us to think about?
And I appreciate, obviously, that this is quite an open question. I think the main reflection is a question of what we do next in this context. So a lot of this is reflecting on what the experience has been to date. And so distributors, feel free to provide your insights of what's happened today, or retailers should share that as well.
It's Sean from Tango here. I'm happy to go first. So I think what we found is that while the package has helped, what we found is, because there wasn't very much consultation before it was given, what we find is that a lot of customers who come to us aren't actually eligible for the package, whereas the package actually benefits customers who haven't actually asked for it, especially for the small business relief.
So that's interesting. Do you have specific examples, or like in terms of why there's this mismatch?
So because of the way that the small business package is administered, right? What actually happens is we get a file from the we get a file from the DBs saying, oh, these are the customers who are eligible for the rebates, and we basically pass on whatever those rebates are. But then we, like, out of say maybe 100 grand of those rebates, very little of it is actually customers who are actually asking us for it. So we're kind of in a situation where the customers called up asking us for help and saying, look, I've heard we're eligible for all these rebates. Are we eligible? And then we go out and check, and they aren't.
Okay.
Yeah, interesting. So it sounds like the small businesses who are actually taking this step to contact retailers or yourself for relief, for whatever reason, is not hitting the eligibility criteria.
Correct.
Hi, Aaron. It's Steph here from Red and Lumo. Just wanted to point out, so our small business, I'm involved in the communication aspect of the small business relief for our customers. I just want to point out that the package was positioned as this massive relief package that was going to deliver all these savings and all these benefits to consumers. But for small businesses, which is the bit that I've been involved in, the large majority of these customers have either pretty much been mothballed, which was the customers that were targeted by the networks, or they've had to have had a 75% reduction in usage over the period. So in terms of our April data, a lot of the customers are receiving between $1 and sort of around the $50 mark. There's not, for small business customers, there's not a lot of real benefit being delivered. And it was very, very well written press releases. And I guess that's what's driving the calls into Sean and all the other call centers around the place. But yeah, there's a lot of customers who we're putting credits on their accounts of, you know, sub $10 who are calling us and saying, why are you even doing this? Like, I thought this was supposed to be something really good.
It's Adam from Alinta here. Certainly echo that. It's been minimal or non-existent, the actual financial transfer to these customers, because a lot of them have pretty much ceased production. So yeah, same thing. It's in our business. It's been next to nothing that's been handed through this part of the package.
So I sort of just wonder, and some others might have some comments to go further on this, but is this just because of what I'm hearing? Is it because the energy consumption has actually decreased so much that the application of these deferrals or charges, reduction in charges, have not then that applied because the energy consumption is not there?
It only targeted customers who had had a 75% or more reduction in usage. So cafes who have stayed open and who still have all their fridges running and still have all their you know, they're still making takeaway food, not eligible, despite the foot traffic and the consumption of their food and produce being not as high. So it was targeted, it was announced to be really helping customers, but to date, we haven't seen that being translated into actual help.
Just similarly, Aaron, I mean, for the residential customers, from memory, it only targeted those customers that went into some form of COVID hardship through the eligibility period. Now, you know, recognise it's a difficult balance and a trade-off, but arguably, though, a lot of customers already in hardship were probably more impacted by COVID than those entering, and those received no benefit. So it was quite limited in that extent. That respect.
And I think I just want to add to that the New South Wales distributors don't have this distinction, so they haven't actually given a cut-off date for when you had to enter hardship.
Yep. I'm just conscious if there's any other reflections.
Aaron, Tom Hallam here from AusNet.
Hi, Tom.
Just interested in any thoughts from the retailers on alternative thresholds. I mean, admittedly, we were coming up with things very quickly at the start of the crisis so that we could get things moving quickly. In hindsight, what would some alternative thresholds look like if we were starting again from scratch?
I'll jump in from a big retailer. Yeah, I think supporting any customer that was experiencing hardship, and that could be defined by the ESC or PDF or just the retailer's own hardship program, would have made sense. These customers who were in hardship prior to COVID were still in hardship when COVID kicked in. So providing assistance to all of those would have been good. And similarly, would have been good to expand this to larger retailers. So the similar sort of assistance was provided to small retailers. Yeah, because I know from our perspective, the requirements to obtain these sorts of benefits have been probably too much to even bother with in a lot of instances, so the customers haven't really benefited from them at all.
Sorry, can I just jump in there? And it's Lucy from E&A. In terms of small business customers, there's no distinction between a large and small retailer. The same offerings are made. So you're talking in particular about residential customer support there?
Yep.
And so deferrals are offered to both, and that was sort of in their announcement, there was some differences in terms of residential customers. And we had feedback from some of the small retailers. So the Victorian distributors actually expanded the package in consultation with the retailers, and in feedback that was received through that process, and sort of expanded the T's and C's on that. The small.
So Lucy, can you just outline to the Commission what you did change, where it was and where it is now?
Oh yes, so I mean, E&A announced a package, and then it was implemented at a jurisdictional level. And for example, in Victoria, the Victorian distributors got together with retailers, and some of the small retailers asked for deferral options, but to receive cash flow support. So for example, then that was the 20% deferral option was offered to small retailers in response to feedback received, and sort of then taking on feedback in terms of for small business customers wanting relief sooner rather than having to wait for a 3-month period. So, and providing the list of eligible small business customers in order to try and reduce their administration burden on the retailers.
Yeah, so that was compared with a complete wiping of the bill from a retailer perspective in order to get some sort of relief from the DB.
Pardon me, sorry, I didn't catch that.
So that was where the Victorian distributors ended up, instead of requiring small retailers to wipe the entire bill in order to get some sort of payment from the distributor.
So for small business, irrespective of whether you're a small retailer.
No, I'm talking about residential now.
So for residential customers, there is a requirement for them to write off the end bill for the rebate to be received. Residential customers. For small business customers, that is not a requirement. There's an expectation that they'll pass through the network charges, but there's no requirement to write off the end bill. So there's that's a sort of another example of a modification that the VicDB's made in response to retailer feedback. Along with, for example, the 20% deferral for residential customers, small retailers, and their ability to provide thresholds. And then for the rebates for residential customers, there's no evidence requirement for the retailers in order to receive that rebate if they go under that threshold.
So I guess the point for Aaron and Felix is small businesses received absolute relief of, as I said, between 0 and around the $50 mark overall. Residential customers didn't get any direct contribution to their bill unless the retailer signed up with the distributor to actually wipe the entire bill, which would mean that the retailer lost out on the retail component and the wholesale component of that customer's bill, as well as getting the rebate from the DB. And only small retailers, of which we are not one, had some sort of ability to defer some payment to the network, but that didn't flow on to actual customers at all.
I'm sorry, I will jump in and say that large retailers are actually offered an opportunity to defer certain residential bills. It's just they don't have the blanket 20% deferral.
I think I'm hearing two things. There's really two aspects to this. One is the write-off of network charges which apply direct to the customer, and it sounds like there's some thresholds and criteria that sets. And then there's a deferral part, which is really a deferral for the purposes of the retailer itself, as I understand.
Yes, and that rebate is actually like purely is revenue that would be able to be received, but the distributors have taken that as revenue that they'll deliberately under recover and not recover through their revenue cap.
It's Stephen Guzzi from Cover You. I'd like to make a comment. Our business is about 80% SME, and both in New South Wales and Victoria. And what I'm hearing across is very similar to our experience. We can only see about a 3% benefit of this whole network relief. But in addition to the restrictions, one of the criteria was your limitation, not in just about the consumption drop, which was unreasonable or not practical, but the other one was the restriction on the 40, I think, megawatt hour cutoff. And a lot of small businesses like restaurants, F&B, people that are told to close or operate in a very lean way, but they don't sit under that category. And that I think that's also something you should reconsider.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm just also noting Alan has just sent a message in the chat. And I think there seems to be a theme just on the thresholds on some of the feedback that I've heard so far. So to Alan's point, he's saying, with the unfortunate events of the second lockdown, which is unfortunate as of yesterday, now should be a good time for a reset by the DBs to extend their package and go to a much higher threshold reduction of consumption. Knowing what we now know of the impacted customer base, all retailers should be provided the same offerings for residential customers, should not miss out because of who their retailer is. So I think there's two bits in that question. One's about the threshold reduction of consumption, tailored for, I guess, the current, what we think we understand the needs of customers are currently. And then the other about the eligibility of the network package dependent on retailer. And I just note the next slide's going to also talk about what's being proposed via the AEMC rule change that we're looking at as well. So there might be a bleeding into conversations there as well.
Yeah, so unless we've got any more comments on what the current package is doing, I'm happy to move forward. If everyone else is.
I think the only other thing I would ask is, we have talked about this threshold, but we don't really know what that threshold would actually be. I think, Tom, you are asking about what that would actually be, if I recollect.
Yes, Aaron, it's the small business threshold in particular I was asking about. Obviously, we did pick a threshold that was meant to represent a business going into hibernation. That was its intent. It's probably, I think I sent some figures yesterday, certainly on our network, it's around 7% of our small business customers in electricity and about 9% in gas. So that's a significant chunk of the customer base that is eligible under that threshold. So really interested in alternative workable thresholds from the retailers would be useful for the conversation.
So we have a comment from Travis. He suggested doing the same thresholds for those that are access the JobKeeper. Could be a reasonable threshold.
So I think for just the purposes of that conversation, look, we're happy to receive stakeholder submissions on this, just for us to know and understand, and we will make these submissions public unless otherwise stated. But I might, Felix, we might go to the next part unless there was any other questions or thoughts.
Okay, so the next part is really trying to discuss going forward what the future could look like, noting that the AMC is currently doing the urgent rule change, and they've indicated that that will be finalised by 23 July. So we are aware and we are conscious about the financial obligations that retailers have and will continue having going forward, and these ongoing costs of providing their customer support. They have proposed a rule change to continue on some form of deferral approach to help alleviate some of that cash flow pressure, and the ANC are considering that, which should be finalised, as I said, 23 July. However, because of where the rule change sits, it does not apply to Victoria, and so it's left to us to think about. And we have noted that stakeholders have generally said that they expect more customers will need support in the future, particularly as some of the government support drops off. I continuously do hear the September cliff being mentioned. So our question to you is, do you think anything further should be put in place after this initial package is finished? And if so, what would that be?
Just to follow on from that, I recognise there's been a number of discussions and workshops associated with the AMC rule change, and obviously not applicable to Victoria, but we're happy to hear if there's anything specific for Victoria that might be unique, or whether a lot of the discussions that were raised there are applicable for our environment too.
Yeah, hi, it's Adam Nason here from City Power, Powercore and United Energy. So I guess just on that and acknowledging in particular the announcement yesterday that it is ongoing, we'll be following suit with AusNet and Gemina on a modified extension of the package focused on small retailers and deferrals for July, including the 20%. And then also for the eligible residential and small business customers. So we'll be making contact with retailers in the next couple of days to extend that offer in line.
Thanks, Adam. And just to confirm, is that just for July, or is that July to a certain period?
So eligible charges in July for now. I guess that.
Sorry, Aaron. Tom Helm here. The intent is to fill the gap until the AR rule change is known. So it is assuming that the AR rule change would be applied in some way in Victoria, but obviously that is subject to further discussion. So it's basically an offer to fill the gap until we see the AR rule change.
Yep. And I know there was some signalling about the intent of the rule change and how that would apply to Victoria too, Tom, if it's finalised.
That's correct. That's correct. And as the Victorian DBs have indicated previously, where we believe we could apply the AR rule changes effectively through voluntary agreements here in Victoria. If that was considered necessary, we're certainly open to that. It's probably also just worth noting from the gas sector, the AR rule change, my understanding is it will not apply to gas businesses, but nationally the gas distributors have announced that they are extending a targeted deferral package for support of small retailers for a further 6 months, basically to the end of the calendar year. And that should, again, offer a very similar support to what the AR rule is intending to achieve.
We also have a question from Steph. Will the extension still only be eligible for customers that were with their retailer on 1st of April?
In effect, yes, we're extending the exemptions in the same way, but because we're offering a 20% deferral, I think that my understanding is that more than captures your entire hardship customer base. That's my understanding. Because I don't think, well, we're not aware of any retailer that has more than 20% of its residential customers on hardship at the moment, or any numbers actually coming anywhere near to that. But, you know, this is why we believe the 20% is actually very generous, and should offer good cash flow support for those smaller retailers.
So I think with that in mind, look, I'm mindful that this workshop might just be useful to help flesh out some of those questions that retailers might have. But you know, this could be a separate discussion with distributors as well. You know, I think the only other thing that hasn't been talked about in further detail is about this threshold. And so, look, just welcome any comments that I guess retailers who your customers at this point, if there's any thoughts on that.
Hi, Aaron. It's Ben from the AC here. I just wanted to ask a question. I'm a little confused about the role of the ESC in this discussion. We seem to be having a good discussion between retailers and networks about a voluntary package that the networks implemented, which I think is a really positive step. We now seem to be talking about, you know, what the appropriate amount was that should have been given for a previous period. And it seems to be under a framing of the regulator in Victoria might be taking steps to make some changes or requiring network businesses to provide some sort of support to retailers. So I think in that framing, we really need to think about what the objective is of the ESC. If the ESC is just trying to really find out what's going on, and then maybe they'll replicate the AER rule change in Victoria down the track, then that's one step. An alternative approach, and obviously Victoria has taken a different path to the national framework by putting out a draft decision that imposes a significant number of additional protections that retailers aren't compensated for in the normal framework. So if the intent here is to share some of the cost burden of that, then that's a very different conversation. So I guess I'm a bit confused about what we're getting out of this meeting today. It sounds to me like the ESC is acting as a mediator between retailers and the networks, which doesn't seem particularly helpful. So I guess I'm keen to try and get a bit more of an understanding of what you're thinking and how we might progress this discussion moving forward.
Thanks, Ben. No, that's clarifying. I think the key thing here is obviously the distributors are offering a voluntary package here in line with the AER rule change or the AEMC rule change. It's a good observation in terms of what our role would be in terms of facilitating this. What I'm hearing is if the settings of these packages seem appropriate, then a voluntary regime could work very well. And so in part, yes, we're trying to hear that from retailers at this point. And I'm not hearing huge amounts of debate, if you will, at this point.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. I guess it's a question of, because you're a regulator, right? So the question has to be, ultimately, it looks voluntary, but it's going to start looking regulated, if you like. I mean, are you going to be looking to regulate certain things of this voluntary package? I mean, otherwise it sort of becomes a social conscience conversation rather than actually being a full, a properly regulated framework. I mean, if it's a voluntary framework, to Ben's point, it needs to be absolutely clear what it is you guys want to influence within that framework itself, I guess is my point. Otherwise, if you say you want to just broadly put different thresholds in, but it's up to you guys to sort that out, that just adds confusion to the whole process. I think if you're going to be involved in this and it's still going to be a voluntary concept, I guess it just needs to be absolutely critical what it is you guys are going to regulate within that voluntary framework, because ultimately you are a regulator. So as long as that's crystal clear, then yeah, that's the only commentary I've got around this, is making sure there's no confusion about your role, and those are the stakeholders within it too.
I think there is a threshold question of whether we need to actually step in at this point as well, from what it sounds like so far, and that's why there was no draft decision posed on this, on an actual position on that point.
Fair call.
Now, I'm sort of conscious that I don't want to draw this out any longer than it needs to, given the last few comments about the intentions of this. So I invite any other thoughts or comments before we close it out.
This is Libby from ERM. Just looking at that question you've got here up on the slide, do you think there's anything further that should be put in place after the initial relief package? We would see that any, obviously, cash flow assistance is welcome from the networks, but we believe there's a place there for distributors to share debt write-off. And that's given that retailers are currently wearing this credit risk for the whole supply chain.
Thanks, Libby. All right.
Warren, what are the
Yes.
linkages between this section of the COVID support payment section, or the COVID support, and the VDO decision, and between this and sort of the rest of the paper, which is about providing benefits to customers? The conversations that we've had has all been about providing support to retailers, but is there an expectation from the ESC that there'll be some sort of customer benefit other than retailers staying alive out of this?
Yeah, that's a good question, Steph. And I think, I think earlier on when we talked about it, and some aspects of what I hear this package is the direct customer may see it. Some of it may be further down the line. It is an interesting one. I think the reason why we included this as part of the draft decision report is the context and environment that we're in, and the relation to obviously the pandemic and the discussions that's been happening at AEMC and AER. So that was the context, and hence why we didn't put a draft decision on it.
So it's Ben here again. Look, before we wrap up, then I might just give some broad comments to what I've heard today. I think in general, the network support package really worked on a targeted set of customers, and that was those who were hibernating rather than working on which customers needed support. So that was an initial problem in the initial package, where retailers are required more broadly, when a customer comes to them and asks for support, they take that as the need for support rather than a particular customer characteristic. So that was an initial challenge with your package. In terms of moving forward, the AER rule change, it doesn't provide any sort of broad it provides cash flow support for very specific circumstances. I don't think it provides much more than that. We at the AEC supported the rule change, but really don't think it's a silver bullet for any of the problems facing retailers. The additional challenge that's facing retailers, that if the ESC is really trying to consider this from a holistic, appropriate place, is who is the right party to hold the risks that are being incurred in the market at the moment. So the original market was drawn up, and retailers held cash flow risk for the whole chain, and that's appropriate. I think that they should hold that risk, but we do have requirements that are being placed on retailers by regulators such as the ESC to undertake additional tasks that are not compensated for in the usual framework. So to Steph's point earlier about the VDO, as a regulator, you probably need to start thinking about how those costs get passed through, or is there a more appropriate way to mitigate those risks? So if a retailer is going to be asked to provide significant hardship support to small businesses, so the original regulatory framework did not consider that, then we need to start thinking about how retailers are compensated for that. Now, one approach might be for network businesses to support retailers to provide that support. An alternative approach might be to increase the VDO. So I think that's where the ESC needs to start thinking about how they want to compensate retailers for the additional challenges that you're placing them under. So I think this is a good conversation. It's really a challenging one for retailers. They don't have much bargaining power here in a voluntary package conversation. It's certainly a welcome package, and we're very keen to try and work with the networks if they are considering further packages in the coming months as we continue to work through this evolving pandemic. But in terms of a regulator, the ESC, you're imposing obligations on retailers. Those retailers need to be recovered. They need to be compensated for those tasks that you're putting them under. So we need to start thinking about what the best way is to mitigate the risks. And that might be through sharing some of the risks that are being put on for a very short period through monopoly businesses. It might be through increasing the VDO. There's a number of tools that you could take. The government could increase the concessions. There are a number of different ways that you could achieve the outcome. It's on the ESC. If you want to play in the space, you need to start thinking about what the objective is you're hoping to achieve and how we can move forward as an industry to deliver the outcome to customers.
Thanks, Ben. I think that was a useful summary of some of the things that were captured today. I'd probably just end by saying, obviously, this is a workshop that's very focused on a very key one element of what we propose in this report. Some of the things that you mentioned, Ben, obviously we had a robust discussion on Monday and Tuesday about these things. So safe to say, yes, the Commission is considering all these things, hence why it's come out in one single report. So yes, thanks for the conversation so far. I just want to pause there if there's any other thoughts or comments. Otherwise, I'm going to wrap it up early for us. All right. Thank you, everyone, for your time. Felix, I think there's some next steps.
Yep, so next steps, a lot of you will be familiar with this slide. So we'll be publishing this recording with the slides and a summary of the conversations that we've had. If anyone wishes to make further comment, you can put it in a submission through Engage Vic with the time and date there. And we're open for any further engagement. If you want to reach out to us, just send an email through to this email address.
So thanks everyone for taking the time. Note that the announcement yesterday obviously was is a rough one for everyone involved through the lockdown. So stay safe and keep well. Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone.